admutu palai mea trope, tinas pod hedras tastemoi toas depe, hicteriois cladois in existemenoi, polis tolumen thymiamaton geme, homu de paianum de caestenagmaton. Aego dicaion me parangelon tecna alonacuem, autos hodeleluta, ho pasi klenos Oedipus calumenos.
What you have just seen and heard is the beginning of a Greek tragedy, the tragedy we are going to study in the next 4 lessons. It was originally performed in Greek, the language you have just heard, and the actors wore masks like the one you have just seen. We are going to study it, of course, in an English translation, and we shall see scenes from it performed, though our actors will not wear masks. The name of the play is Oedipus the King. It was written by Sophocles, and it was first performed in a faraway European city called Athens in Greece on the Mediterranean Sea. The first performance of Oedipus the King took place almost 2,400 years ago. 2,400 years is a long time. Much has happened since then. This is when the play was first produced. Since then, a great new religion, Christianity, has come into the world. A new continent has been discovered. A new nation has been born. Some of you may be wondering why we have to go so far back in time to study the humanities. How can we see ourselves more clearly and understand our own situation better by reading a play that was written in Athens so many centuries ago? What has the Athens of the age of Sophocles, the 5th century before Christ, got to do with us here, now, in America, in the 20th century AD? Well, in this course on the humanities, we are concerned with certain fundamental questions. Questions we all ask ourselves if we are human beings at all. What is man? What is he doing on this earth? How should he live? Many of these questions were first seriously asked in ancient Greece. It was in Greece that man first began to take stock of himself and the world around him. And in doing so, he laid the basis not only for the humanities, but for the sciences too. The play we are going to study, Oedipus the King, is concerned with these great questions. And even though it is a very old play, we may find that the answers it proposes are important for us here, now. But before we can hope to understand the play, we must know something about the people, the period, and the country which produced it. As we look at scenes of that country, the thing which still impresses us today is the light, the hard, clear sunlight in which everything is bathed, so that every detail of landscape, of mountain, valley, rock, and sea shows up in sharp relief. The forms of the landscape are not softened and disguised by mist. The strong light shows up everything, every peak on the rocks, every color in the marble. In such an atmosphere, it is impossible not to see things as they really are. And perhaps this helps to explain why it was here, in Greece, that the first attempts to understand the nature of the world were made. As the Greeks looked at the earth on which they lived, they asked the question which, as far as we know, had never been asked before. That question was, what is the world made of? Are there a number of basic elements, or perhaps only one, out of which all the features of the landscape are made? We are still working on that question, and the name of the science which deals with it is physics, the study of physis, which is the Greek word for nature. One of the answers that the Greeks proposed to the question, what is the world made of, is of great interest to us today, for it is the beginning of the answer on which we are still working. In the age of Sophocles, two Greek philosophers proposed an atomic theory, the idea that the whole universe, those mountains, rivers, clouds, the sea, the animals, and man himself, were all made up of particles so small that they could not be made any smaller. These particles they called atoms, because the Greek word atomon means something that cannot be cut or split. Our scientists have, of course, succeeded in splitting the atom, but the fact remains that modern atomic physics is a development of a theory which was first put forward 24 centuries ago in Greece. The Greeks did not confine their questions to the world around them. Another of the questions they asked themselves, and one that we are still asking ourselves today, is, what is man? What is his place in the universe? In the age of Sophocles, a philosopher called Protagoras proposed an answer to that question, which was typical of the new scientific outlook. Man, he said, is the measure of all things. He meant that everything in the universe must be considered from the point of view of man, that man is the center of the universe, and man's intelligence is capable of finding the answers to all the secrets of life. This was a new idea in the world. Never before had man assigned himself such an imposing place in the universe. Why was it first put forward in Athens, in the age of Sophocles? There were good reasons. The city of Athens had just taken the lead in a great war. The small Greek cities had successfully thrown back the vast invasion armies of the Persian Empire, an eastern despotism which controlled the whole land mass from the Aegean to the borders of India. The Greek victory astonished the world, the Greeks included, and Athens went on to reap the fruits of victory with enthusiasm and newfound energy. Athens became rich and the ruler of an empire. Her citizens rebuilt the city which had been destroyed by the Persian invaders. They erected buildings which, even though in ruins today, are still some of the most beautiful buildings in the world. One of these is the Parthenon, the temple of the goddess Athena, on the great rock formation which lies in the center of the city. But the Athenians had something more than great buildings and an empire. They had a revolutionary form of government, which they called democracy. The word democracy means, in Greek, rule of the people. Athens was the first democracy in the history of the world. This free form of government, government by discussion and compromise, gave men for the first time in history an opportunity to question and discuss not only political affairs, but also those greater and deeper questions which are the subject matter of this course in the humanities. One of these questions is, what is man? And we have seen that the philosophers of Athens had a new answer for it. Now, to ask and to try to answer important questions is the beginning of science, of philosophy, of everything that makes people alive and aware. But questions are disturbing things. They raise difficult problems. They upset old ideas, sometimes without suggesting new ones. Whenever new and challenging questions are asked, they produce a conflict. You have probably realized this in your own lives. When you first questioned something you had always taken for granted, it was no doubt a disturbing experience. The questions asked by the philosophers and scientists in ancient Athens, their investigations into the nature of the universe and of man, were a challenge to the old ways of thinking. These questions had an especially disturbing effect on the old religious outlook, the ideas the Greeks had lived by for many centuries. The old Greek religion was not the same as ours. The Greeks believed not in one god, but in many. These gods, in a way, were an earlier, simpler explanation of the universe and of life. So, for instance, to the question, what causes thunder, the old Greek would have replied, Zeus, the sky god. Zeus is the supreme god, the Father. He is the god of the sky, and he is balancing the thunderbolt which he is about to throw onto the earth. Here he is an angry god who brings down the great trees with his lightning. But he could be kind, too. He could send the rain on which man's life depends, and also the bright, clear sunlight in which the Greeks lived so much of their lives. Zeus, the father god, had many children. One of his daughters was the goddess Athena, whose name resembles that of the city of Athens, and who was its patron goddess and protector. The temple on the Acropolis of Athens, the Parthenon, was dedicated to her and contained her statue. Zeus, the father god, had sons as well as daughters. One of the sons of Zeus was Apollo, who was a healer of sickness. He had another important function, too. He foretold the future to human beings. His temple at Delphi was an oracle, that is, a place to which the Greeks came to consult the god about the future. The priests of Apollo, claiming that they spoke for Apollo, answered questions on all kinds of subjects, such as, what shall we do about the plague? Shall I get married now? How will my business venture turn out? The god prophesied, foretold the future, not only to cities, but also to individual human beings. Another of the sons of Zeus was Dionysus, a handsome, dark, and bearded figure with a wreath of ivy leaves on his head. He was the god who represented for the Greeks the power and force of all green living things. Dionysus had one special place of worship which was different from the temples of the other gods. It was the theater. The plays performed in the theater at Athens were part of the worship of Dionysus. This theater was called the Theater of Dionysus, and his priest sat in the seat of honor in the front row. These are some of the most important of the gods who were worshipped in the temples of ancient Greece in the 5th century BC. For centuries, the Greeks had sacrificed at their altars, danced in their honor, consulted their oracles, prayed to them for help and guidance. But in the age of Sophocles, the new critical and scientific outlook began to question the power of these gods and even their existence. The atomic theorists, who believed that the universe consisted of millions of atoms, all exactly alike, did not believe in Zeus and Apollo. Protagoras, with his view that man is the measure of all things, was doubtful too, and wrote a famous book on the gods in which he treated them skeptically. Only the first sentence of his book has come down to us, but it is a sentence which tells us a great deal. Here is the beginning of it. Concerning the gods, I do not know whether they exist or do not exist. Older generations of Greeks had believed that Apollo was the healer of sickness. But in the 5th century BC, a school of doctors under Hippocrates laid the foundations of a new scientific medicine. For the first time, they observed and compared symptoms, established the nature and course of diseases, and made possible diagnosis, a Greek word, which means distinguishing between one disease and another. Apollo the healer seemed to be replaced by man, whose scientific knowledge made him a more efficient healer than the god. As a result of all these human achievements, It was quite natural that many of the keenest intellects in Athens and elsewhere questioned the whole structure of the accepted religion and began to see a new dignity and power in man and his capacity to control the world. Man is the measure of all things. You can see this new proud view of man expressed in the sculptures of the period. The face of this young man, carved in Athens in the 5th century BC, has the same dignity and power we have already seen on the face of Apollo. Man seems to be on the same level as the gods. This, then, was the atmosphere of the time. New visions of man's greatness were challenging the old religious ideas. The average man still prayed to Zeus, consulted the oracle of Apollo, worshipped Athena in the Parthenon. But he no longer took his religion for granted. It was a subject for debate and discussion, and everywhere in Athens this discussion went on. It was only natural that the poets who wrote for the theatre in Athens should reflect in their plays this excited discussion of new and old ideas. And the play we are going to study, Oedipus the King, is in fact a part of that discussion. The play takes a stand on some of the great issues of the day. But before we get to the play, we must understand a few things about the theatre in which it was performed, the theatre of Dionysus. This ruined site in the center of Athens is where the theatre of the Western world began. The Athenians invented the theatre as well as democracy. To get a better idea of what an ancient Greek theatre was actually like, let us look at the theatre at Epidaurus, which is better preserved. It wasn't, as you could see, like our theatres today. It was an open-air theatre, and the huge audience sat on rows of stone benches, one above the other, like benches in a football stadium. It was different from our theatres in other ways, too. You couldn't go to the theatre in Athens whenever you felt like it. It was active only once a year, in the early spring, when the festival of Dionysus took place. When the Athenians did go to the theatre, it was an important event. They went there at sunrise and sat through a program which included 3 tragedies like Oedipus the King, all written by the same poet. They did this for 3 days running, watching the work of 3 different dramatists. The playwright didn't make any money out of his play, nor did the producer, who was a wealthy man paying the expenses of the performance as a public service. There was a charge for admission, but it was very small, and citizens who could not afford to pay it were given free tickets. The audience then was not a select group. Rather, it was the whole population. The theatre of Dionysus, in its original state, had seats for 14,000. The performances they saw in the theatre of Dionysus were in some ways very different from what we expect to see in our theatre. One of the big differences was that the actors wore masks, like this one, the one we saw at the beginning of this lesson. We do not know the reason why the Greek actors wore masks. It was something left over from the time when the drama was a more primitive ritual. The masks were a relic of the past, but they had their uses. With masks, one actor could play more than one part. This was very useful, for trained actors who could speak clearly enough to be heard by 14,000 people in the open air were scarce. But with the masks, the same actor could come on in a later scene in a different part. In fact, all the speaking parts in Oedipus the King were taken by 3 actors. The masks were not the only survival of an earlier stage of the drama. There was a chorus, a group of dancers who also sang and took part in the action of the play. The chorus, like the masks, was a legacy from the past, but it too had its uses for the dramatist. For example, it could be used to represent the common people, to comment on or react against the speeches of the actors, who usually represented their kings and rulers. Now here is a model of a Greek theatre. I'm going to use it to give you an idea of how the opening scene of the play, Oedipus the King, was first performed. You can see the rows of benches on which the huge audience sat. The circle in the middle, which is where the chorus danced, and the stage building, in front of which the actors performed. It is early morning, and the audience has filled the benches. There is a trumpet call, and everyone falls silent. There are no lights to go on, and no curtain to go up. Round the corner of the stage building, moving out to a position in front, comes a procession of priests carrying branches of olive, which they put down on the altar in front of the stage building. Then the doors of the stage building open, and a man comes out to meet the priests, the man we saw at the beginning of this lesson. He asks them why they are seated at the altar, what it is they want from him. He asks the question which we in the audience are asking ourselves too. The play has begun. The audience does not yet know who this actor is supposed to represent. There is no program as there is in our theatre, the time and place of the action and the cast of characters. The audience has to be given all this information in the first few minutes of the play by the characters in the play themselves, and they are. At the end of that first short speech, which you heard at the beginning of the lesson, the actor identifies himself. I myself, he says, world-famous Oedipus. The audience recognizes the name. It is a name they know, and they know the story too. The Greek dramatist, unlike our modern dramatists, presented stories which the audience already knew. The story of Oedipus is strange and terrifying. It begins in the city of Thebes with a king called Laius and his queen Jocasta. They lived under a terrible threat, for they had been told by the god Apollo, speaking from his oracle at Delphi, that a son born to them would kill his father and marry his mother. A son was born to them, but they tried to make sure that the child would not grow up to do the dreadful things the god had predicted. The only way to do that efficiently was to kill the child, but Laius, understandably, couldn't bring himself to do this in person. Instead, he ordered one of his shepherds to take the child up to the mountain near Thebes, Mount Kethyra, and leave it to die in the cold night air. To make sure it wouldn't crawl away to shelter, the child's ankles were pierced and pinned together. But the shepherd took pity on the child, and instead of leaving it out on the mountain, he gave it to another shepherd. This shepherd came from Corinth, on the other side of the mountain range. He took the child down with him and gave it to the king and queen of Corinth, who had no children of their own. They were called Oedipus and Merope. They named the child Oedipus, which means, in Greek, swollen foot. His feet had been injured when they were pinned together. Oedipus and Merope brought Oedipus up in Corinth as their own son. Oedipus had no idea that his real parents were Laius and Jocasta, and Laius and Jocasta thought that their child was dead. But when Oedipus was a young man, someone told him that he was not the son of Oedipus and Merope. To make sure of the truth, he went to Delphi, to the oracle of Apollo, to ask the god. Apollo did not answer his question, but instead told him, "You will kill your father and marry your mother." Since he thought his parents were Oedipus and Merope of Corinth, Oedipus determined never to go back to Corinth again. He set out to find a new home. On the way, he came to a narrow crossroads, a place where three roads met. There, he was ordered off the path by an old man in a chariot. Being a proud young man, he refused to obey. The quarrel ended in a fight in which Oedipus killed the old man and his attendants. This old man was Laius, the real father of Oedipus. And so the first part of Apollo's prediction was now fulfilled. But Oedipus did not know this and went on his way. He came to Thebes and found the city in distress, in need of a hero to deliver it. Thebes had become the prey of a monster, the Sphinx, a strange creature, part bird, part lion, part woman, who attacked and killed the Thebans. She looked harmless, even beautiful, but she killed ruthlessly. She would go on killing ruthlessly, she said, until someone answered her riddle. Many had tried, but failed, and the Sphinx had killed them. The Thebans, who were without a king now, offered a great reward to anyone who could answer the riddle. The reward was the throne of Thebes and the hand of the Queen Jocasta in marriage. Oedipus volunteered to face the Sphinx. Here is a Greek vase with a picture of Oedipus and the Sphinx. The riddle of the Sphinx was, there is a creature which is 2-footed and 4-footed and 3-footed and has one voice. When it goes on most feet, it goes most slowly. Oedipus answered the riddle correctly. The answer is man, who goes on all fours as a small child and then goes most slowly, on 2 feet as an adult, and on 3 when he is old, because he needs a stick to help him along. So Oedipus solved the riddle of the Sphinx. He was made king of Thebes and given the hand of Jocasta in marriage. And so the prophecy was fulfilled. Oedipus killed his father and married his mother. But at the beginning of the play, he does not know what he has done. As we study this play in the next 3 lessons, we shall see what Sophocles did to the strange old story. He made out of it a tremendous discussion of the great issue of the day. The issue we talked about earlier in this lesson, the conflict between the new outlook and the old religious beliefs. As the play went on, the Greek audience began to feel that the masked actor was not just Oedipus, a king in an old story, but a figure who represented their own hopes and fears, who wrestled with the great and sometimes agonizing problems of their own faith and doubt. And perhaps we too will find that he is not just the hero of an old play, but that he represents us in America today, our hopes and our fears.